close your eyes for a second and imagine this. You're standing in a massive library, and every single person who has ever lived has their story written in a book on these shelves. Billions of books stretching on forever. You walk down the aisles, running your fingers along the spines. Your parents are here, your grandparents, your great-great-great-grandparents going back hundreds of generations. You keep walking backward through time, past the pyramids, past the Ice Age, past the invention of language itself, and then suddenly you hit a section where almost all the books are just gone. Not hidden, not lost, gone. Like they were never written at all. That's not a metaphor. That actually happened to humanity. Between 900,000 and 800,000 years ago, there's a hole in our history so profound, so complete, that for decades scientists couldn't even prove it existed. They just knew something was wrong. The math didn't add up. The fossils didn't make sense. It was like trying to solve a murder mystery where 98% of the evidence had been erased, and the few clues that remained were screaming that something catastrophic had happened, but nobody could figure out what. This isn't ancient aliens or conspiracy theories. This is hard science that's only been confirmed within the last few years, and what they found is absolutely terrifying. Our ancestors, the people whose DNA you carry right now, came within a hair's breadth of complete extinction. We're talking about a population crash so severe that it makes every disaster in recorded history look like a minor inconvenience. Imagine the entire future of humanity depending on a group of people small enough to fit inside a couple of apartment buildings. That's what happened. And here's the part that keeps scientists up at night. It didn't last for a year or a decade. It lasted for over 100,000 years. That's longer than modern humans have existed as a species. If you're watching this to fall asleep, perfect. That's exactly why I make these. So maybe hit subscribe and drop a comment telling me where you are and what time it is. I read through them, and it's wild seeing Tokyo at lunch, London at midnight, Miami at dawn, all watching together. But back to our mystery. See? Every species on Earth leaves behind evidence of its existence. Bones, tools, footprints, something. The more individuals there are, the more evidence they leave. It's basic statistics. If there are millions of elephants, you're going to find elephant fossils. If there are billions of humans today, future paleontologists will have no trouble proving we existed. But between 900,000 and 800,000 years ago, human fossils almost completely disappear from the archaeological record. For over a century, anthropologists called this the fossil gap and assumed it was just bad luck. Maybe our ancestors lived in places where fossils don't preserve well. Maybe we just haven't dug in the right spots yet. Except it wasn't bad luck. The fossils are missing because the people were missing. In 2023, a team of geneticists led by Wenjing Hu at the Chinese Academy of Sciences published a study that changed everything we thought we knew about human evolution. They had analysed DNA from over 3,000 modern humans, tracking genetic mutations backward through time like reading a molecular history book. And what they found was impossible. The genetic data showed that around 930,000 years ago, the human population collapsed to approximately 1,280 breeding individuals, not 1.28 million, not 128,000, 1,280 people. That's smaller than most high schools. That's a population so small that everyone probably knew everyone else. And somehow, impossibly, they held on for 117,000 years while the world around them fell apart. This is what biologists call a genetic bottleneck, and it's written into the DNA of every person alive today. It's why humans have weirdly low genetic diversity compared to other animals. Chimpanzees, who live in scattered groups across Africa, have 4 times more genetic variation than all 8 billion humans combined. That's not normal. That's the signature of a species that almost died out. But here's where it gets even stranger. We don't know where these survivors lived. We don't know exactly what they ate, how they organized themselves, or what technologies they had. We have almost no fossils from this period, no cave paintings, no elaborate tools, just the ghost of their existence preserved in the deepest layers of our genetic code. What we do know is that something happened during this bottleneck that changed us forever. Our chromosomes fused together, reducing our count from 48 to 46. Our brains started getting bigger. Our social behaviours became more complex. It's like the near extinction event didn't just test our ancestors, it transformed them into something new. The question that haunts researchers is simple but profound. What happened during those missing 100,000 years? What brought humanity to the edge of extinction? And how did a tiny group of survivors manage to not just endure but eventually thrive? The answer to that question is written in rocks, in bones, in ice cores, and in the very structure of your DNA. And it's a story that will change how you think about what it means to be human. Let's go back, way back, to a time before the crisis, before the bottleneck, before everything nearly ended. We're talking about 950,000 years ago, give or take a few thousand years. And here's what you need to understand. The world was full of humans, not empty, not sparse, full. The early Pleistocene was a wild time to be alive. The planet was cycling through dramatic climate shifts every 40,000 years or so. Ice ages would grip the northern latitudes, locking up massive amounts of water in continental glaciers that stretched from the North Pole down to what's now New York and London. Sea levels would drop by 300 feet, exposing land bridges between continents. Then, just as life adapted to the cold, the cycle would flip. The ice would retreat, temperatures would soar, grasslands would explode across regions that had been frozen wasteland just a few thousand years earlier. But here's the thing. Humans were thriving in this chaos. They'd figured out the pattern. They'd learned to move with the climate shifts, following the resources as they appeared and disappeared across the landscape. When the ice advanced, they moved south. When it retreated, they expanded north again. This wasn't random wandering. This was sophisticated strategic migration. The archaeological record from this period is stunning. We're finding evidence of human activity everywhere. Africa, obviously, that was still the population centre, but also across Asia into Europe, even reaching what's now China and Indonesia. These weren't occasional explorers or lost wanderers. These were established populations with permanent or semi-permanent settlements, sophisticated tool industries, and complex social structures. Take Homo erectus. By 950,000 years ago, they'd been around for almost 1 million years already. They weren't primitive knuckle-draggers. They were accomplished survivors who had colonized most of the old world. They stood upright, walked exactly like we do, and had brains about 70% the size of modern humans. Which doesn't sound impressive until you realise that's larger than any other animal on Earth except us. They'd mastered fire, not just occasional use, but systematic controlled fire management. Archaeological sites from this period show hearths, fire pits with stones arranged around them to contain and direct heat. They were cooking food, which meant they could extract more nutrients from what they ate. They were using fire to harden wooden spears, making them deadlier hunting weapons. They were probably using it for light and warmth, extending their active hours into the night and allowing them to survive in colder climates. Their tools were becoming increasingly sophisticated. The simple Alderwan choppers that had dominated human toolkits for over 1 million years were giving way to Acheulean hand axes. These aren't just rocks with sharp edges. These are carefully crafted symmetrical implements that required planning, skill, and an understanding of stone fracture mechanics. Some hand axes from this period show evidence of being reworked multiple times, maintained and resharpened like valuable possessions. But Homo erectus wasn't alone. There were other human species walking the earth. Homo habilis, the handyman, was still around in parts of Africa. Smaller than erectus, with slightly smaller brains, but accomplished toolmakers in their own right. They lived in groups, hunted cooperatively, and had probably developed sophisticated communication systems. Then there were the early archaic humans, populations that were transitioning between erectus and what would eventually become modern humans and Neanderthals. These groups show up in the fossil record across Africa and Eurasia, displaying a fascinating mix of primitive and advanced features. Some had remarkably modern-looking skulls but robust, heavily muscled bodies. Others showed signs of the cranial expansion that would eventually lead to our massive brains. The population estimates for this period are staggering. Conservative estimates put the total human population across all species at somewhere between 500,000 and several million individuals. That's not a species on the edge of extinction. That's a successful, expanding, thriving group of organisms that had figured out how to dominate diverse environments across 3 continents. Archaeological sites from this period tell stories of complex behaviors. At Gesher Benot Yaakov in Israel, dated to about 780,000 years ago, researchers found evidence of systematic nut processing. Humans were collecting nuts, cracking them open with specific tools, and probably storing them for later consumption. This suggests planning, delayed gratification, the cognitive ability to think beyond immediate needs. In Africa, sites like Olorgesailie in Kenya show continuous human occupation spanning hundreds of thousands of years. The tool assemblages there are massive, literally thousands of hand axes and other implements scattered across ancient lakeshores where our ancestors lived, worked, and raised their children. Generation after generation, century after century, millennium after millennium, humans kept coming back to these places because they worked, because they provided everything needed for survival. In Asia, sites in China show Homo erectus populations thriving in environments ranging from tropical forests to cool temperate woodlands. At Zhoukoudian Cave near Beijing, archaeological deposits spanning hundreds of thousands of years reveal continuous occupation, evidence of fire use, bone tools, and the remains of countless meals. These weren't transient camps. These were home bases, places where families lived for generations. The migration patterns were extensive and regular. Humans were moving raw materials for tools across distances of over 100 miles, suggesting either long-distance travel or extensive trade networks. Both possibilities point to sophisticated social organization. You don't trade with strangers unless you have some system for ensuring fairness and maintaining relationships over time. The fossil record shows regular patterns of birth, life, and death. Children, adults, elderly individuals, all showing up in archaeological contexts that suggest they were being cared for by their communities. We find evidence of individuals with healed injuries that would have been debilitating, meaning someone was providing food and protection while they recovered. We find elderly individuals with worn teeth and arthritis, suggesting they'd lived long past their prime productive years because their communities valued them, probably for their knowledge and experience. This was a world where humanity had found its rhythm. The climate cycled, sure, but humans had learned to cycle with it. Resources shifted, but humans shifted too. It wasn't easy, survival never is, but it was working. The population was stable, possibly even growing slowly over time. Then something changed. Around 900,000 years ago, maybe a bit earlier, the archaeological record starts doing something strange. Sites that had shown continuous occupation for hundreds of thousands of years suddenly go quiet. tool assemblages that had been abundant and diverse become sparse and simple. The signs of thriving human populations begin to fade. At first, archaeologists thought this was just preservation bias. Maybe the fossils and artifacts from this period had been destroyed by natural processes. Maybe we just hadn't found the right sites yet. But as more and more regions were surveyed, the same pattern kept showing up. Abundant human activity before 900,000 years ago, then a dramatic decline, then nearly nothing for hundreds of thousands of years. Key sites across the Old World tell the same story. Olorgesailie in Kenya, continuous occupation for nearly 1 million years. Then the layers from 900,000 to 800,000 years ago show dramatically reduced activity. Zhoukoudian in China, occupied for hundreds of thousands of years, shows a mysterious gap in the record right around this same time period. Sites across Europe and Western Asia that had produced abundant fossils and artifacts suddenly have almost nothing from this crucial period. It's like someone flipped a switch. One moment, humans are everywhere, leaving evidence of their lives scattered across continents. The next moment, they're ghosts, barely detectable in the archaeological record. What makes this even more puzzling is that the climate, while challenging, wasn't doing anything unprecedented. The Ice Age cycles were continuing as they had for millions of years. There was no obvious environmental catastrophe that should have affected humans more than it affected other species. Yet somehow humanity went from thriving to barely surviving. The population estimates for this period tell a shocking story. Before the gap, maybe 1 million humans across all species spread across the Old World. During the gap, the numbers crashed to perhaps a few tens of thousands at most. Some estimates go even lower, suggesting just a few thousand breeding individuals kept the entire human lineage alive during the worst periods. This wasn't a regional crisis. This was global. Whatever happened affected human populations from Africa to Asia to Europe simultaneously. Every population we can track shows the same pattern of decline. Some disappeared entirely, their evolutionary lines ending forever. Others contracted to tiny remnant populations clinging to survival in isolated refuges. The world before the gap was full of possibility. Multiple human species, expanding populations, increasing technological sophistication, growing social complexity. Everything pointed toward continued success and diversification. Instead, something pushed humanity to the absolute edge of extinction. Something reduced us from a dominant, widespread species to a handful of desperate survivors fighting for every breath. And here's the most haunting part. We still don't know what it was. The gap sits there in our past like a black hole, a period of time that swallowed almost all evidence of what humans were doing, where they were living, how they were surviving. The world before the gap was bright and full of life. The world after would be forever changed. But the gap itself? That remains one of the greatest mysteries in human history. So how did we discover that humanity nearly went extinct? How do you even find evidence of something that almost didn't survive to leave evidence? That's the beautiful, slightly terrifying thing about modern genetics. Your DNA is a time machine. Every cell in your body carries a record of every generation that came before you, stretching back millions of years. And if you know how to read that record, it tells stories that no fossil ever could. The discovery didn't happen all at once. It wasn't one brilliant scientist having a eureka moment. It was more like a slow-motion detective story that unfolded over decades, with different researchers in different countries independently stumbling onto the same disturbing conclusion. Something catastrophic had happened to our ancestors, something that had pushed humanity to the absolute brink of extinction. The first hints came in the late 1990s. Population geneticists had begun doing something that sounds simple but was actually revolutionary. They were comparing DNA samples from people all over the world, looking for patterns in the genetic variations between populations. Here's the thing about genetic diversity. It takes time to accumulate. Every generation, random mutations occur. Most do nothing. Some are harmful and get weeded out by natural selection. A few are beneficial and spread through populations, but over hundreds of thousands of years, you accumulate a massive amount of genetic variation. Different populations in different places develop different sets of mutations. Unless something happens to stop that process, unless something kills off most of your population, leaving only a tiny group of survivors, then your genetic diversity crashes. It's like taking a library with millions of books and burning it down until only a few dozen volumes remain. Sure, you can rebuild the library over time, write new books, but for a long time you'll have way fewer titles than you should. That's what geneticists were seeing in human DNA, way less diversity than there should be. In 1999, a team led by a researcher named Pascal Gagneux published a paper comparing human genetic diversity to that of chimpanzees, and what they found was shocking. Humans, spread across every continent, adapted to every climate imaginable, had less genetic variation than a few hundred chimpanzees living in a single forest in Africa. Think about that. 7 billion humans. Less genetic diversity than a few hundred chimps. Something had clearly gone very, very wrong in our past. But the early researchers couldn't pinpoint exactly when or how severe the bottleneck had been. They knew it had happened. They just didn't know the details. That required a different approach, a deeper dive into the genetic record. Enter mitochondrial DNA. This is the genetic material that lives not in your cell nucleus, but in the mitochondria, the little powerhouses that generate energy for your cells. Mitochondrial DNA is special because it's only inherited from your mother. Your father's mitochondrial DNA doesn't get passed on. This creates a clean, unbroken genetic line stretching from you back through every mother in your ancestry, all the way to the first woman. Geneticists call her mitochondrial Eve, though that's a bit misleading. She wasn't the only woman alive at the time. She was just the one woman whose mitochondrial DNA survived in an unbroken maternal line to the present day. By analysing mitochondrial DNA from thousands of people worldwide, researchers could construct a kind of family tree showing how all modern humans are related through their maternal lines. And this tree revealed something extraordinary. The most recent common ancestor of all humans lived somewhere in Africa between 150,000 and 200,000 years ago. That means every person alive today, no matter where their ancestors came from, can trace their maternal lineage back to a relatively small population living in Africa during that narrow window of time. But mitochondrial DNA only tells you about maternal lineages. What about the fathers? That's where Y chromosome analysis comes in. The Y chromosome is passed from father to son, creating a similar genetic trail through paternal lineages. And when researchers analysed Y chromosome data, they found something similar to the mitochondrial results. All modern human males can trace their Y chromosomes back to a single population living in Africa around the same time period. Two independent genetic systems, inherited in completely different ways, both pointing to the same conclusion. Humanity went through an extreme population bottleneck. But how extreme? That required some serious mathematical modelling. Around 2008, researchers developed new computational methods that could estimate ancient population sizes based on patterns of genetic variation. They could look at how mutations were distributed across modern human genomes and essentially calculate backward, figuring out how many breeding individuals would have been needed to produce the patterns we see today. The numbers that came back were shocking. During the most severe phase of the bottleneck, which genetic dating methods place somewhere between 930,000 and 813,000 years ago, the human breeding population may have dropped to as low as 1,280 individuals. Some studies suggested it might have been even lower, maybe as few as 2,000 people total, including children and the elderly. That's not a small town. That's a few villages. That's a population small enough that every person could theoretically know every other person by name. When these calculations first came out, a lot of scientists were skeptical. A bottleneck that severe should have left other traces. If humanity nearly went extinct, where were the fossils? Why didn't we see evidence of this catastrophe in the archaeological record? That's when researchers started looking more carefully at the fossil evidence, or rather at the absence of fossil evidence, and they found something remarkable. There's a strange gap in the African fossil record between about 950,000 and 800,000 years ago. Fossils of human ancestors are relatively abundant before that period. They're abundant after it. But during that critical window, human remains become mysteriously scarce. At first, archaeologists had assumed this was just preservation bias. Maybe fossils from that period hadn't survived, or we hadn't found the right sites yet. But as more expeditions went out specifically looking for remains from this period, and kept coming back empty-handed, a different explanation started to look more likely. There weren't many fossils from this period because there weren't many humans. The genetic bottleneck and the fossil gap were telling the same story. But different research teams were still arriving at slightly different numbers for the severity and timing of the bottleneck. Some studies suggested the population dropped to 18,500 individuals. Others said 1,280. Still others proposed numbers in between. Was this a devastating near-extinction event, or just a significant but manageable population decline? The breakthrough came in 2023 when a team of researchers from China, Italy and the United States published a comprehensive analysis in the journal Science. They used a new computational method called FitCol, which could analyze entire genomes from thousands of individuals and reconstruct ancient population history with unprecedented precision. Their conclusion: the bottleneck was real, it was severe, and it lasted for an almost incomprehensibly long time. For approximately 117,000 years, the human breeding population remained below 1,300 individuals. That's not a brief crisis. That's thousands of generations living on the absolute edge of extinction. One bad drought, one epidemic, one volcanic eruption in the wrong place at the wrong time, and humanity would have been finished. The study also helped pinpoint the timing more precisely. The bottleneck began around 930,000 years ago, reached its most severe point around 900,000 years ago, and didn't really end until about 813,000 years ago. That's a crisis that spanned nearly 1,000,000 years of human history. A 1,000,000-year time gap where our ancestors were fighting desperately for survival, and we have almost no direct evidence of how they lived or where they survived. But here's where things get really interesting. The same study that confirmed the bottleneck also revealed what might have ended it. Remember that chromosomal fusion we talked about earlier? The one that gave humans 46 chromosomes instead of 48? Genetic dating methods suggest that fusion became fixed in the human population, meaning everyone started carrying it, right around the time the bottleneck was ending. This isn't a coincidence. The fusion had to happen during the bottleneck. In a large, widespread population, a chromosomal mutation like that would have been diluted, probably lost within a few generations. But in a tiny population that was geographically constrained, living in a few refugia scattered across Africa, a beneficial mutation could spread rapidly. Within just a few thousand years, everyone could carry it. And if that fusion provided some kind of advantage, better neural development, improved cognitive abilities, enhanced social cooperation, it could have been the key that unlocked humanity's survival. The thing that let our ancestors not just endure the crisis, but eventually thrive when conditions improved. The scientific debate continues. Some researchers still question whether the bottleneck was really as severe as the genetic data suggests. They propose alternative explanations. Maybe there wasn't a single catastrophic event that reduced the population, but rather a long period where different human populations went through separate, smaller bottlenecks at different times. Maybe the genetic patterns we see today are the result of complex population structures and migration patterns rather than a simple crash in numbers. But with each new study, the core conclusion grows stronger. Something happened to humanity between 950,000 and 800,000 years ago. Something that pushed us to the absolute brink. The genetics don't lie. The fossil gap doesn't lie. Multiple independent lines of evidence all point to the same terrifying truth. For more than 100,000 years, humanity hung by a thread. We were an endangered species, scattered across Africa in tiny vulnerable groups, facing environmental challenges that killed off most of our population and nearly finished off the rest. Every person alive today is descended from the small group of survivors who somehow made it through that nightmare. We are all products of the worst crisis in human history. We carry genes that were tested and refined under the most extreme conditions imaginable. But what actually happened during those 117,000 years? What caused the bottleneck in the first place? What kind of catastrophe could reduce a widespread successful species to just over 1,000 breeding individuals? And what conditions could sustain that crisis for so long that it defined human evolution for nearly 1 million years? That's where things get really fascinating, because we have several theories, each supported by different types of evidence, each painting a different picture of what those dark ages might have been like. And some of them are absolutely terrifying, because the forces that nearly destroyed humanity once could easily do it again. We just need to understand what we're looking at. So what actually caused the bottleneck? What could push our ancestors to the absolute brink of extinction and keep them there for over 100,000 years? Scientists have proposed several theories, each supported by different lines of evidence, each terrifying in its own way. Let's start with the most compelling one, climate catastrophe. Now, when we talk about climate change today, we're talking about temperatures rising a couple of degrees, sea levels creeping up, weather patterns shifting. That's serious stuff, no question. But what happened during the bottleneck period was something else entirely. Something that makes our current climate concerns look like a minor inconvenience by comparison. Around 900,000 years ago, Earth's climate system underwent what scientists call the mid-Pleistocene transition. This wasn't just another ice age. This was a fundamental restructuring of how the planet's climate worked. And for human populations barely hanging on in Africa, it was an extinction-level event. Here's what you need to understand about ice ages. They're not constant. The planet doesn't just get cold and stay cold. Instead, Earth's climate oscillates between glacial periods, when ice sheets cover huge portions of the continents, and interglacial periods, when the ice retreats and things warm up. For most of the past few million years, these cycles happened roughly every 41,000 years. Cold phase, warm phase, cold phase, warm phase. Predictable, relatively stable. But then came the mid-Pleistocene transition. Suddenly the cycle changed. The oscillations stretched out to roughly every 100,000 years. And more importantly, they became far more extreme. The cold periods got colder, the warm periods got shorter, and the transitions between them became more violent and unpredictable. The evidence for this comes from dozens of sources, but the most dramatic is locked in ice. Antarctic and Greenland ice cores preserve a continuous record of Earth's climate going back hundreds of thousands of years. Every layer of ice contains tiny air bubbles trapped when the snow first fell. Those bubbles are time capsules preserving the exact composition of Earth's atmosphere at that moment in history. When scientists analyze these ice cores, they can measure temperature, atmospheric carbon dioxide, methane levels, even the chemical signature of dust blown from distant continents. And what they see during the mid-Pleistocene transition is absolutely stark. Temperature drops of 10 to 15 degrees Celsius, that's 18 to 27 degrees Fahrenheit, not gradually over millennia, but relatively quickly, within just a few thousand years. Ocean sediment cores tell the same story from a different angle. As ice sheets grow, they lock up massive amounts of water, causing sea levels to drop by 100 meters or more. That's over 300 feet. Entire coastlines that humans knew and depended on simply vanished, replaced by barren, wind-scoured continental shelves. But here's the really nasty part. The climate didn't just get cold and stay cold, it became wildly unstable. Temperature swings that would normally take tens of thousands of years started happening in centuries or even decades. Rainfall patterns that had been reliable for generations would suddenly shift, turning grasslands into deserts and back again within a human lifetime. For your ancestors living in Africa, this was catastrophic. Remember, they weren't spread across the whole continent. They were concentrated in specific regions where resources were abundant and predictable. River valleys with reliable water, grasslands with large herds of animals, coastal areas with marine resources. The climate shift destroyed all of that. Rivers that had flowed for millions of years dried up completely. The archaeological record shows ancient river channels across North Africa that simply stopped carrying water during this period. We're not talking about seasonal droughts. We're talking about rivers vanishing for thousands of years at a stretch. The grasslands collapsed next. As temperatures dropped and rainfall patterns shifted, the savannas that had supported huge populations of grazing animals began to shrink. Some areas turned into desert. Others became dense, impenetrable forest that human hunting strategies weren't adapted for. The comfortable middle ground where humans thrived simply disappeared across vast regions. And the animals, the megafauna that humans had depended on for food, they were dying too. The fossil record shows massive extinctions during this period. Species that had existed for millions of years vanishing in geological eye blinks. Giant herbivores that humans hunted, medium-sized prey animals that provided reliable calories, even small mammals that could sustain a family through hard times, all of them declining precipitously. This created what ecologists call a trophic cascade. When the large herbivores died off, the plants they had kept in check exploded in some areas and vanished in others. When plant communities shifted, insect populations crashed. When insects died, birds and small mammals followed. The entire ecosystem was collapsing, and humans were right in the middle of it, dependent on every level for survival. Paleoclimate data from African lake sediments shows the extent of the disaster. Lake Malawi, one of the great African rift lakes, nearly dried up completely during the worst of the Bottleneck period. Lake levels dropped by hundreds of feet. Areas that are now deep open water were barren mudflats. And this wasn't just one lake. It was happening across the entire continent. The Sahara, which had oscillated between desert and grassland for millions of years, locked into a permanent hyperarid state. The Kalahari expanded. Even regions that stayed relatively wet experienced such violent fluctuations that human populations couldn't establish stable settlements. You might find a good location with water and game, settle in, raise a few generations, then suddenly the rains would fail for decades, and you'd have to move or die. But here's what made this climate disaster different from previous ice ages. It wasn't just that conditions got harsh. Humans had survived harsh conditions before. What made the mid-Pleistocene transition so deadly was its unpredictability and duration. Previous ice ages had followed predictable patterns. Populations could adapt, could develop strategies, could learn when to migrate and where to find refuge. But this was different. The climate was shifting on timescales shorter than human cultural memory. Survival strategies that had worked for your grandparents' generation could be completely useless by the time you had children of your own. This created an evolutionary pressure unlike anything humans had faced before. Suddenly, flexibility mattered more than specialized adaptation. Groups that had become perfectly adapted to specific environments found themselves at a disadvantage when those environments vanished. But groups that could adapt quickly, that could learn new hunting strategies, exploit new resources, and cooperate to share knowledge, they had a chance. The genetic evidence supports this. Modern human genomes show clear signatures of selection for cognitive flexibility during this period. Genes related to brain development, neural plasticity, and social cognition all show evidence of strong natural selection right around the Bottleneck timeframe. We weren't just surviving the climate disaster, we were being shaped by it, evolved by it into something new. But evolution takes time, and in the meantime, people were dying. Archaeological sites from this period are heartbreakingly sparse. Where we might expect to find hundreds of occupation sites showing continuous human presence, we find gaps. Empty millennia where nobody lived in regions that had supported human populations for hundreds of thousands of years before and would support them again thousands of years later. The few sites that do exist tell stories of desperate adaptation. Tool technologies become more diverse, suggesting people were exploiting every possible resource. We see evidence of humans eating foods they hadn't touched before. Tough, low-quality plant materials that require extensive processing. Marine resources from rocky coastlines that are difficult and dangerous to harvest. Small game that provides minimal calories for the effort required to catch it. Some groups seem to have moved into caves and rock shelters, permanent refuges that could be defended and used year after year. These sites show evidence of intensive occupation. Thick layers of ash from fires burned continuously for warmth and protection. Bone accumulations showing every edible animal in the vicinity being hunted. Stone tools made from increasingly poor quality materials because people couldn't risk travelling to distant quarries for better stone. And the caves also show something else. Evidence of violence. Skeletal remains with trauma that could only come from weapons. Signs of cannibalism during the very worst periods. Archaeological evidence of settlements being abandoned suddenly. Belongings left behind, suggesting people fleeing from some immediate threat. This wasn't a noble struggle against nature. This was desperate, brutal survival, where groups competed for dwindling resources and losing meant extinction. The climate had divided the human population into isolated pockets, each one fighting to stay alive, many of them failing. But some succeeded. Somehow, impossibly, around 1,280 breeding individuals survived it all. They survived the cold and the drought. They survived the collapse of ecosystems they had depended on. They survived watching their territories shrink to tiny refuges while the rest of the continent became uninhabitable. They survived competition with other human groups, with predators, with disease, and they did it for 117,000 years. That's not just one generation weathering a storm. That's thousands of generations, each one facing the same desperate struggle, each one managing to produce enough children to keep the population from winking out entirely. The climate catastrophe theory explains the bottleneck's duration. Unlike a sudden disaster that kills quickly and then passes, the mid-Pleistocene transition created conditions that were persistently hostile to human survival. The climate would occasionally improve slightly, populations would begin to recover, then conditions would worsen again, pushing numbers back down. This created what population biologists call a demographic trough. Not quite extinction, but populations kept so low for so long that recovery became almost impossible. Every time humans started to bounce back, another climate shift would hammer them down again. But here's the crucial question. Why did humans survive when so many other species didn't? What was different about our ancestors that let them cling to existence through the worst environmental crisis in human history? The answer lies not just in the climate catastrophe itself, but in how it interacted with other factors. Volcanic eruptions, disease, competition with other species, each one making the situation worse, each one requiring different survival strategies. The climate catastrophe was the foundation of the bottleneck, the underlying cause that created the conditions for near extinction. But it wasn't working alone. To understand the full story, we need to look at the other theories, the other hammers that were striking at human populations already weakened by environmental collapse. Because sometimes the biggest disasters aren't caused by one catastrophic event. Sometimes they're caused by everything going wrong at once, by multiple crises combining and amplifying each other until survival seems impossible. And yet, impossible or not, our ancestors survived. The question is how? And more importantly, what did that survival cost them? But what if the climate catastrophe we just discussed wasn't the whole story? What if something even more dramatic happened? Something violent and sudden that turned an already difficult situation into an absolute nightmare. Enter the supervolcano theory. Now, when most people think of volcanic eruptions, they picture something like Mount St. Helens. Big, dramatic, destructive, sure, but ultimately a localized disaster. The eruption happens, some people die, ash falls in a relatively small area, and within a few years life goes back to normal. Supervolcanoes are nothing like that. A supervolcano eruption is an extinction-level event. We're talking about explosions so massive they inject billions of tons of ash and sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, material that doesn't come down for months or even years, material that spreads across the entire planet, blocking sunlight and dropping global temperatures by 10, 15, sometimes 20 degrees Fahrenheit for years. Imagine waking up one morning and the sun just never fully rises again. Not because of clouds, but because the entire sky has turned grey, ash falling constantly, coating everything in a fine powder that gets into your lungs, your food, your water. Temperatures plummeting week by week until even tropical regions experience frost. Plants dying because photosynthesis becomes impossible. Animals starving because the plants are gone. And humans who depend on both plants and animals, facing a choice between starvation and cannibalism. This isn't science fiction. This is what supervolcanoes do, and the geological record suggests it might have happened right in the middle of our missing million years. The evidence comes from something called ash layers, thin bands of volcanic material preserved in rock formations and ice cores. Geologists have identified several massive ash deposits dating to between 1.2 million and 800,000 years ago. These aren't ordinary volcanic deposits. The chemical signatures and the sheer volume of material suggest eruptions on a scale that would make Krakatoa look like a firecracker. One particularly massive ash layer dates to around 1 million years ago, right when the genetic bottleneck was at its worst. The ash spread across at least 3 continents, suggesting an explosion powerful enough to inject material into the jet stream, where it could circle the globe multiple times. But here's where the supervolcano theory gets really interesting. We actually have a more recent example of what these catastrophes can do to human populations. 74,000 years ago, Mount Toba in Indonesia exploded in what scientists consider one of the largest volcanic eruptions in the last 2 million years. The explosion was so massive it left a crater 60 miles long and 18 miles wide. It ejected an estimated 670 cubic miles of rock and ash into the atmosphere. To put that in perspective, Mount St. Helens ejected less than 1 cubic mile. Toba's eruption triggered what scientists call a volcanic winter, a period of 6 to 10 years where global temperatures dropped by about 15 degrees Fahrenheit. But the effects lasted much longer. The ash and sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere continued blocking sunlight for decades. Ice cores from Greenland show the cooling period lasted over 1,000 years. And what happened to human populations during this time? The genetic evidence suggests we came terrifyingly close to extinction. Some studies indicate the global human population crashed to maybe 10,000 individuals, maybe fewer. One supervolcano, one eruption, nearly wiped us out. Now imagine that happening not once but multiple times over a period of several 100,000 years, because that's what the geological evidence from the earlier Bottleneck period suggests. Not just one massive eruption, but a whole series of them, each one pushing human populations close to the edge. The first eruption hits, temperatures drop, food becomes scarce. Your ancestors struggle, but they adapt. They find refuges where conditions are slightly better. They develop new survival strategies. Population numbers stabilize at a new, lower level. Then, just as they're starting to recover, boom, another eruption, bigger than the first. Ash blocking the sun for years, temperatures dropping even further. The refuges that worked during the first crisis stop working during the second. Groups that survived the first disaster get wiped out by the second, and this pattern repeats again and again and again. Each eruption acts like a hammer, smashing human populations down to smaller and smaller numbers, and, unlike gradual climate change, which gives species time to adapt and migrate, volcanic winters happen fast, too fast for normal evolutionary processes to keep pace. This is why the supervolcano theory is so compelling. It explains the speed and severity of the bottleneck in ways that climate change alone can't. Yes, the Earth was going through an ice age. Yes, conditions were getting harder, but ice ages typically develop over thousands of years. Populations can adapt, they can migrate, they can find new strategies. Volcanic winters give you no time. The eruption happens, and within weeks, your entire world has changed. The plants you depend on stop growing. The animals you hunt start dying. The water sources you rely on get contaminated with ash, and there's nowhere to run because the ash is falling everywhere. But here's what makes volcanic winters even more devastating. They don't just kill you directly through starvation and cold. They trigger cascading failures across entire ecosystems. First, the plants die. Not all of them immediately, but photosynthesis becomes dramatically less efficient when sunlight drops by 50% or more. Trees and large plants with stored energy reserves might survive for a while, but grasses, herbs, and other fast-growing species, the foundation of most food chains, they collapse within a single growing season. Then the herbivores start dying. Deer, antelope, elephants, any animal that depends on plants for food, faces immediate starvation. The old and young go first, then the adults. Within a year or two of a major eruption, herbivore populations can crash by 90% or more. Then the carnivores, including humans, start dying. Not because their prey is gone entirely, but because hunting becomes exponentially harder when there are 90% fewer animals to hunt. A human group that could reliably take down an antelope every few days suddenly finds themselves travelling for weeks between successful hunts. Starvation becomes the norm, not the exception. But it gets worse. Because humans aren't just carnivores, we're omnivores. We depend on both plant and animal foods. When both collapsed simultaneously, we're in serious trouble. Our ancestors couldn't just switch to an all-plant or all-meat diet. They needed both. They needed the quick calories from plants and the protein and fat from animals. Take away either one, and survival becomes extremely difficult. Take away both, and it becomes nearly impossible. And that's exactly what volcanic winters do. They remove both plant and animal food sources simultaneously, leaving human populations with almost nothing to eat. There's another factor that makes humans particularly vulnerable compared to other species. We have long generation times. Mice can produce a new generation every few months. If 90% die in a volcanic winter, the survivors can repopulate within a year or two. Humans take 15 to 20 years to reach reproductive maturity. If 90% of a human population dies, recovery takes decades, maybe centuries. This means we're extremely vulnerable to sequential disasters. One volcanic winter might reduce population by 50%. If a second eruption happens before full recovery, it might reduce the remaining population by another 50%. A third eruption does it again. Within a few generations, you've gone from millions of individuals to thousands, then hundreds. And the geological record suggests that's exactly what happened. Multiple massive eruptions, one after another, each one hitting human populations before they could fully recover from the last. But here's the most terrifying part of the supervolcano theory. The eruptions wouldn't have been evenly distributed. Some regions would have been hit much harder than others. Areas downwind from the eruption sites would have received feet of ash, making them completely uninhabitable. Other regions might have received only a light dusting, remaining marginally livable. This would have created what scientists call population sinks and sources. Sink regions where conditions were so bad that local populations couldn't sustain themselves, constantly declining toward extinction. And source regions where conditions were just barely good enough for populations to maintain themselves, maybe even grow slightly during good years. Survival would have depended entirely on whether your ancestors happened to be in a source region. It wouldn't matter how smart they were, how well adapted, or how sophisticated their tools. If they were in the wrong place when the eruptions hit, they died. No exceptions. This introduces an element of pure luck into human evolution that's deeply unsettling. We survived not because we were the best, the smartest, or the most deserving. We survived because some of our ancestors happened to be in the right place at the right time, and then they got lucky again, and again, for hundreds of thousands of years. The supervolcano theory also explains something that the pure climate change hypothesis struggles with: the sheer speed of the bottleneck. Genetic evidence suggests human populations crashed very rapidly, possibly within just a few thousand years. Climate change usually works more slowly than that. But a series of massive volcanic eruptions? That could absolutely crash populations that fast. There's also intriguing evidence from archaeological sites. Several locations in Africa dating to the Bottleneck period show sudden abandonment layers, places where humans had been living continuously for thousands of years, and then suddenly, nothing. No more artifacts, no more bones, just a layer of ash, and then silence. What happened to the people who lived there? Did they migrate to better territories? Did they die trying? The archaeological record doesn't say, it just shows absence. Communities that had existed for millennia, erased from history in what might have been a single generation. But if the supervolcano theory is correct, it also explains how we survived. Because volcanic winters, as devastating as they are temporary. The ash settles eventually, the sulfur dioxide breaks down, the sun returns, and when it does, life rebounds with surprising speed. The survivors, those lucky few whose territories remained just barely livable during the crisis, would have found themselves in a world recovering from catastrophe, a world where all their competitors had been wiped out, where resources, though initially scarce, would gradually become more abundant as ecosystems recovered. Those survivors would have learned something invaluable: how to survive when the sky goes dark and the world turns cold. They would have developed survival strategies, technological innovations, social structures capable of holding communities together through years of hardship, and they would have passed those survival skills down to their descendants. Skills that would prove essential when the next disaster struck, because there's always a next disaster, always another crisis waiting around the corner. The question isn't whether catastrophe will come, but whether you're prepared when it does. The supervolcano theory suggests our ancestors weren't just passively lucky, they were actively learning, adapting, preparing. Each crisis eliminated the unprepared and selected for those who could innovate under pressure. Over hundreds of thousands of years, this brutal selection process would have refined human survival abilities to an incredible degree. We became the species that survives volcanic winters. That's our evolutionary niche. Not the fastest, not the strongest, but the most adaptable when everything goes wrong. But was it really supervolcanoes? Or was something else happening during those dark millennia? Because the truth is, we still don't know for certain. The supervolcano theory fits some of the evidence, but not all of it. There are gaps in the story, questions that volcanic eruptions alone can't answer. Which brings us to the third major theory about what caused the bottleneck, and this one is darker than climate change or volcanic winters. Because this theory suggests we weren't just fighting against nature, we might have been fighting against ourselves. But volcanic eruptions and climate disasters weren't the only threats facing your ancestors during that million-year gap. There was something else stalking them, something potentially even more devastating than any environmental catastrophe. Disease. Think about this. You're living 900,000 years ago in one of those tiny groups, maybe 20 or 30 people huddled in a river valley, surviving on whatever resources you can find. You've just made it through a brutal dry season. Half your children didn't survive, but the rains have finally come. Things are looking up. Then someone gets sick. At first, it's just fever and weakness. Nothing too unusual. People get sick all the time in your world. But this is different. Within days, the illness spreads through your entire group. Within weeks, everyone's infected. Some recover, many don't. By the time the sickness passes, your group of 30 has been reduced to 12. Half your hunting knowledge, gone. Half your oral traditions forgotten. Half your genetic diversity erased. Now multiply that scenario across dozens of scattered populations over hundreds of thousands of years. Because here's what we know about disease and small populations. It's a deadly combination. Modern epidemiologists call it the extinction vortex. Small populations are uniquely vulnerable to disease outbreaks in ways that large populations aren't. In a big population, an epidemic sweeps through, kills a percentage of people, then burns itself out when it runs out of hosts or people develop immunity. It's tragic, but the population recovers. But in a population of 20 or 30 people, a single disease outbreak can destroy everything. There's no buffer, no reserve of healthy individuals to carry on if things go wrong. One bad epidemic and the entire group vanishes. And your ancestors during the bottleneck were living in exactly this kind of vulnerable situation. Those 1,280 breeding individuals scattered across Africa, divided into tiny groups that were just barely large enough to survive. Each group was a potential extinction event waiting to happen. Any disease outbreak could wipe them out completely. But where would these diseases come from? In the modern world, we think of pandemics as things that spread from dense urban populations. Surely small scattered groups would be relatively safe from major epidemics, right? Wrong. Dead wrong. Small isolated populations face a different kind of disease threat. They're vulnerable to zoonotic diseases, infections that jump from animals to humans, and Africa 900,000 years ago was full of potential disease reservoirs. Antelope, zebras, wild pigs, monkeys, every animal species carrying its own array of pathogens. Your ancestors were hunting these animals, butchering them, living in close proximity to them. Every interaction was a potential spillover event. Modern genetic studies have shown us something fascinating and terrifying about human disease resistance genes. We have enormous diversity in the genes that fight off infections, far more diversity than we have in most other parts of our genome. This tells us something profound. Our ancestors were under intense selection pressure from disease. For millions of years, pathogens were killing humans in huge numbers, and only those with the right genetic variant survived. But here's where the bottleneck makes everything worse. Remember, the population crash reduced human genetic diversity to almost nothing. All those disease resistance genes that had been accumulating over millions of years. Most of them were lost. The survivors of the bottleneck had whatever immune system genes they happened to carry, and that was it. No backup, no genetic reserves. This created what geneticists call a genetic drift scenario. In small populations, random chance starts playing a bigger role than natural selection. Maybe the people who survived had excellent genes for digesting food or excellent genes for cognitive ability. But maybe they had mediocre genes for fighting off bacterial infections. In a large population, this would balance out, but in a population of 1,280, those immune system weaknesses would be passed down to everyone. The evidence for this is written in our DNA. When scientists analyze human immune system genes, they find something strange. There are certain disease resistance variants that show up in all human populations today, variants that must have been present in the bottleneck survivors. But there are also huge gaps, places where genetic diversity should exist but doesn't. Evidence of immune system variants that were lost during the population crash and never recovered. This genetic vulnerability would have made your ancestors sitting ducks for disease outbreaks. A pathogen that might have only killed 10% of a large diverse population could kill 50% or more of these genetically similar groups, and with populations already at the edge of extinction, those kinds of mortality rates would be catastrophic. But disease wasn't working alone. It was interacting with all the other stresses we've already discussed. Climate disasters would drive populations into refuges, where they'd be forced into close proximity with unfamiliar animal species. New disease exposures. Volcanic eruptions would weaken people through starvation and stress, making them more vulnerable to infections. Environmental degradation would force people to hunt new species, butcher unfamiliar animals, more spillover opportunities. It was a perfect storm of biological vulnerabilities, and the archaeological record gives us hints that something like this was happening. When scientists analyze ancient human remains from the period around the bottleneck, they find evidence of widespread health problems. Bones showing signs of nutritional stress, skeletal deformities suggesting inbreeding, patterns of mortality that look suspiciously like epidemic die-offs. But there's another factor that might have been even more important than disease: competition. Because your ancestors weren't alone out there. Africa and Eurasia, 900,000 years ago, were full of other hominin species, other types of humans, each competing for the same resources, the same territories, the same survival opportunities. We know from the fossil record that this period saw an incredible diversity of human species. Homo erectus was still thriving across Asia. Homo heidelbergensis was emerging in Africa and Europe. Early forms of what would become Neanderthals were already differentiating in Western Eurasia. Your ancestors, the population that would eventually become modern humans, were just one player in a crowded field. And here's where being bottlenecked becomes a serious competitive disadvantage. Those other human species, they had larger populations, more genetic diversity, more established territories. Your ancestors were reduced to scattered remnants, clinging to marginal environments that nobody else wanted. They were the underdogs, in the most literal sense. Competition for resources in a deteriorating environment would have been brutal. Imagine you're a member of one of those tiny bottleneck groups. You finally find a valley with reliable water and good hunting. You start to rebuild. Then another group shows up. Maybe they're your distant cousins, descendants of the same bottleneck survivors. Or maybe they're a different species entirely, Homo erectus or early Heidelbergensis. Either way, they want the same resources you need to survive. What happens? In the best case, you negotiate some kind of uneasy coexistence. In the worst case, you fight. And fighting when you're already at the edge of extinction is a terrible risk. Lose a few adults to violence, and your group might fall below the minimum viable population size. Even winning is costly. The resources you expend on conflict are resources you can't use for feeding children or surviving the next drought. The genetics tells us something interesting here. Remember those 1,280 breeding individuals. Analysis of human DNA suggests they weren't just one homogeneous population. There were probably at least 2 or 3 distinct groups that survived the bottleneck, separated by geography and only occasionally interbreeding. This suggests our ancestors were already dividing up territories, already competing with each other for resources. We were our own worst enemies. But there's evidence the competition went beyond just other early humans. Large predators were also a major threat. Lions, leopards, hyenas, all the big African carnivores that still exist today, plus extinct species like giant hyenas and saber-toothed cats. These predators would have seen small scattered human groups as easy targets, easy prey. Modern studies of isolated human populations give us a window into how devastating this pressure could be. Look at what happened to the indigenous peoples of Tasmania. When they were isolated from mainland Australia around 10,000 years ago, they numbered maybe 4,000 to 5,000 individuals. Not a bottleneck as severe as what we're discussing, but still a small population. Over thousands of years, that isolation led to measurable declines in technological complexity and cultural knowledge. They lost the ability to make certain tools, forgot certain skills. The population was just too small to maintain the full range of human cultural achievements. Now imagine that scenario, but 100 times worse. Your ancestors had populations of dozens, not thousands. The knowledge loss must have been catastrophic. How many survival techniques were forgotten when the elder who knew them died? How many tool-making methods vanished when the expert hunter fell to disease? How much accumulated wisdom just evaporated in the chaos of the bottleneck? This brings us to one of the most insidious threats facing small populations: inbreeding depression. When you only have a few dozen people in your group, your mating options are extremely limited. You're going to end up having children with close relatives, and that causes problems. Genetic problems. Every human carries some harmful recessive mutations. In a large population, these mutations rarely cause issues because you're unlikely to mate with someone who has the exact same harmful mutation. But in a small, isolated group, the math changes. Suddenly you're much more likely to have children with someone who carries the same genetic defects you do. Those harmful mutations start expressing themselves. Birth defects increase. Infant mortality rises. Fertility decreases. The population starts dying faster than it can reproduce. Modern geneticists can see evidence of this in our DNA. The human genome shows signs of what's called a genetic load, an accumulation of slightly harmful mutations that should have been purged by natural selection. The fact that these mutations persisted suggests periods when human populations were so small that natural selection couldn't operate efficiently. The bottleneck period is the prime suspect. Some researchers think this inbreeding depression might have been one of the most severe selection pressures during the gap. Groups that couldn't find ways to maintain genetic diversity would spiral into extinction. Only the populations that somehow managed to exchange mates with other groups, maintaining just enough genetic variation, would survive. This might explain why those 1,280 breeding individuals were so scattered, not just to avoid environmental disasters, but to maintain breeding networks large enough to prevent inbreeding collapse. But here's the really mind-bending question. If all these factors, disease, competition, inbreeding, were creating such intense pressure on your ancestors, why didn't they go extinct completely? What made them special compared to all the other hominin species that did vanish during this period? Because make no mistake, other human species were going extinct. The fossil record shows that hominin diversity was declining. Species that had thrived for hundreds of thousands of years were disappearing. But the ancestors of modern humans held on. Why? The answer might lie in behavior. Remember, this wasn't just genetic selection. This was also cultural evolution. The groups that survived might have been the ones who developed better hygiene practices, better ways of caring for the sick. Maybe they learned to quarantine infected individuals, preventing diseases from spreading through the entire group. Maybe they developed herbal medicines that helped boost immune responses. We can't know for sure, but the genetics suggests something kept them alive when all the odds said they should die. Or maybe it was their social systems, groups that developed strong cooperation, that shared food during shortages, that cared for orphaned children when parents died of disease. These groups would have better survival rates than more individualistic societies. The bottleneck might have selected not just for genetic fitness, but for social cohesion. The groups that worked together best were the ones that made it through. There's also evidence that your ancestors might have developed the first systematic healthcare practices during this period. Neanderthal skeletons show evidence of survival with severe injuries that would have required extensive care from group members, broken bones that healed, infections that were survived, disabilities that were accommodated. This suggests compassion, yes, but also practical medical knowledge. The ability to keep people alive who in earlier times would have died, and that might be the key to understanding how humanity survived the gap, not through individual toughness, but through collective resilience, by developing social bonds strong enough to weather any crisis, by learning to care for each other even when resources were scarce, by maintaining knowledge and sharing it across generations, by refusing to give up even when extinction seemed certain, because the alternative, giving up, meant the end of everything, and somehow, impossibly, your ancestors just kept going. Through the diseases, through the competition, through the inbreeding and the infant mortality and the endless grind of survival, they kept going. And that persistence, that stubborn refusal to vanish, that's what saved the human species. That's what allowed us to be here today, wondering about the gap that almost erased us from existence. So let's talk about what it actually meant to be alive during this period. Not the statistics, not the genetic data, but the raw human experience of living through humanity's darkest hour. Imagine waking up every morning not knowing if this is the year the water source dries up completely, not knowing if the game animals that your family depends on will disappear, like they did in the valley to the south, not knowing if the children you're raising will even survive to have children of their own. Because here's what we're really talking about when we say bottleneck. We're talking about 117,000 years of uncertainty. That's not just a number. That's roughly 5,000 generations of humans living with the constant awareness that their species might not make it. Your great-great-great-grandmother survived, but 7 of her siblings didn't. The group that lived over the next ridge, they've been gone for 3 generations. No one's seen smoke from their fires in decades. The hunting grounds they used to control, empty now, reclaimed by whatever. Harsh landscape had become the new normal. This was the reality for every single person alive during the gap, and yet somehow they didn't just survive. They maintained enough population to keep the species viable. They preserved crucial knowledge across thousands of generations. They kept hope alive when everything around them was dying. So how did they do it? What did daily life actually look like for these ultimate survivors? The first thing you need to understand is that they couldn't live the way their ancestors had. Before the crisis, early humans had probably lived in relatively large groups, maybe 50 to 150 individuals together. That's the social structure that primates are naturally comfortable with. Big enough for protection, small enough to avoid depleting resources too quickly. But during the bottleneck, that wasn't possible. The environment simply couldn't support groups that size, so they had to split up. Not completely, because humans are fundamentally social creatures. We need each other, not just for reproduction but for survival itself. Humans can't thrive in isolation. It breaks us mentally and makes us vulnerable physically. So they found a middle ground. Small groups of maybe 15 to 30 people, extended family units living together but maintaining connections with other groups scattered across the landscape. Think of it like an archipelago. Islands of humanity separated by vast stretches of hostile territory, but still connected by occasional contact and exchange. These groups would have been centered on whatever resources remained reliable, and we actually have some evidence about where these refugees might have been. Genetic diversity studies and climate models point to several possible refugia, places where the environmental catastrophe, whatever its exact cause, didn't hit quite as hard. The Cape region of South Africa shows up repeatedly in these models. It had a unique climate system influenced by the meeting of two ocean currents that might have kept it relatively stable even when the rest of the continent was experiencing extreme conditions. The East African Rift Valley is another strong candidate. Deep lakes fed by mountain runoff, volcanic soils that stayed relatively fertile, microclimates created by elevation changes. Even during the worst droughts, parts of this region might have maintained enough water and vegetation to support small human populations. Some models point to coastal areas where marine resources could supplement declining terrestrial food sources. Shellfish, seabirds, seaweed. These ocean resources don't disappear during droughts the way land animals do. A group living on a coastline would have had a built-in backup food supply when everything else failed. But here's the thing about these refuges. They weren't paradise. They weren't comfortable. They were just barely survivable, which is a very different thing. Archaeological sites from this period, the few that exist, paint a picture of populations living under constant stress. The stone tools show signs of expedient manufacture. Quick, functional, not the carefully crafted implements from earlier periods. When you're struggling to find enough food, you don't spend extra time making your spear point aesthetically perfect. You make it good enough and get back to hunting. The animal bones from these sites tell an interesting story too. Lots of small game, rodents, birds, reptiles, things that modern hunter-gatherers would consider barely worth the effort. But when you're desperate, you eat whatever provides calories. The presence of these small animal bones suggests people were exploiting every possible food source, hunting things their ancestors would have ignored. There's also evidence of intensified processing of plant foods, grinding stones, rudimentary mortars, tools designed to break down tough plant materials that would normally be indigestible, seeds from plants that are toxic without extensive processing. This suggests people were expanding their diets to include foods that required significant preparation, burning calories to process foods that would barely replace the energy spent getting them. This is the signature of populations living on the edge, not thriving, just surviving. But they weren't just passively enduring. They were adapting, innovating, finding new ways to extract resources from an increasingly hostile environment. Fire became absolutely critical during this period. not just for warmth and cooking, which have been important for hundreds of thousands of years, but as a land management tool. Some archaeologists think that humans during the Bottleneck period systematically used fire to maintain small patches of grassland in otherwise forested or desert areas. Burn a section of forest and grasses sprout up. Those grasses attract grazing animals. Those animals provide food. It's not agriculture, not yet, but it's a step toward actively managing the environment rather than just taking what it offers. Shelter became more sophisticated too. The few dwelling sites we've found from this period show evidence of carefully constructed windbreaks, and possibly some of the first true-built structures. When you're living through extended droughts or volcanic winters, natural caves and rock shelters aren't always enough. You need to create your own protection from the elements. This required planning and cooperation, gathering materials, transporting them to a campsite, working together to build structures that could withstand harsh weather. It's another sign that social cooperation was intensifying during this period, that people were learning to work together in increasingly complex ways. But perhaps the most important adaptation was cognitive. The human brain was being refined by the most intense natural selection pressure our species had ever faced. Think about what was being selected for. Intelligence, obviously. The ability to solve novel problems, to figure out new food sources, to invent better tools and techniques. But also social intelligence. The ability to maintain cooperation in small groups under high stress. To mediate conflicts without violence, tearing the group apart. To maintain kinship connections with distant groups, even when you only saw them every few years. Memory became crucial. In a world where the old reliable food sources kept disappearing, survival depended on remembering every detail about the environment. Which plants were edible, where water might be found during the dry season, the migration patterns of the few remaining game animals. This knowledge had to be preserved and passed down because losing it could mean extinction. Language almost certainly became more sophisticated during this period. When survival depends on accumulating and sharing complex information, any improvement in communication provides massive advantages. The capacity for detailed verbal instruction, for describing distant locations, for passing down survival knowledge through storytelling, all of these abilities would have been heavily selected for. But let's talk about the psychological reality of living through this, because it wasn't just physically harsh. It was mentally and emotionally devastating. Imagine living your entire life in a group of 20 people. Those 20 people are everyone you ever see, everyone you ever talk to, everyone you ever have any relationship with. Your world is measured in miles, not continents. Your social universe is bounded by a few familiar faces. Now imagine watching several of those people die, not quickly but slowly from starvation or disease or injury that won't heal. Imagine the isolation when your group drops to 15 people, then 10. Imagine the desperate hope when a trader from another group arrives with news that someone from a distant valley is looking for a marriage partner. Because that's not just romance, that's genetic survival. That's your grandchildren having a better chance of making it through the next drought. The psychological stress of living like this, generation after generation, would have been immense. Some groups probably didn't make it, not because they ran out of food, but because they lost hope. Because watching children starve and elders die broke something in the survivors that couldn't be repaired. But others found ways to cope. They probably developed rituals, stories, belief systems that gave meaning to their suffering. The archaeological evidence of ochre use and possible symbolic behaviour increases during this period. Some researchers think this is when humans began developing systematic spiritual practices, not as abstractions but as psychological survival tools. When the physical world is terrifying and unpredictable, the human mind creates stories that make sense of it. Gods of the hunt who need to be appeased. Ancestor spirits who watch over the living. explanations for why some people survive and others don't that give meaning to random tragedy. These belief systems weren't just comforting, they were survival technology. Shared beliefs create social cohesion. Rituals bring people together and reinforce cooperation. Stories preserve crucial knowledge and pass it down through generations even when many children don't survive to adulthood. The few glimpses we get from archaeology support this. Sites with evidence of intentional placement of objects. Possible ritual spaces separate from living areas. The beginnings of what would eventually become art, religion, and culture. But perhaps most remarkable is what didn't change. Despite 117,000 years of crisis, despite environmental catastrophe that would have broken most species, the core of human technology remained intact. Fire use didn't disappear. Stone tool making didn't regress to simpler forms. The knowledge base accumulated over millions of years of human evolution was preserved through the bottleneck. This tells us something profound about the people living during this period. They weren't just trying to survive day to day. They were actively preserving their heritage, teaching children skills even when those children might not live to use them, maintaining hope that someday conditions would improve and humanity would need all that accumulated knowledge. Every night around every fire, elders were teaching youngsters how to make proper tools, how to track animals, how to find water, which plants healed wounds, which stars to navigate by. Not because it was easy or even particularly useful in that moment, but because letting that knowledge die would mean humanity's past and future dying with it. They were the guardians of civilization before civilization existed, keepers of the flame during the longest dark age in human history. And somehow, impossibly, they succeeded. Through 5,000 generations of hardship, through droughts and famines and diseases and disasters we can barely imagine, they kept the chain unbroken. Every single person alive today is proof that they never gave up, never stopped fighting, never let the species slip into extinction even when extinction seemed inevitable. But they were about to get a reward for all that suffering, because the world was about to change again. And then around 813,000 years ago, something changed. The first signs were subtle, slightly more reliable rainfall in some regions, grasslands beginning to expand again after millennia of desert, animal populations starting to recover. The extreme phase of the climate crisis was ending, but by this time, your people weren't the same species that had entered the bottleneck. 117,000 years of intense natural selection had transformed them, made them smarter, more cooperative, better adapted to survive in harsh environments. They had developed technologies that would have seemed like magic to their ancestors. Better tools, more sophisticated fire management, improved food processing techniques. Most importantly, they had developed social systems capable of maintaining cooperation and knowledge sharing across multiple generations. When the climate began to improve, they were ready. Population growth was explosive. Within a few thousand years, descendants of the bottleneck survivors had spread across Africa and begun expanding into Europe and Asia. They carried with them all the survival skills learned during the crisis, plus the genetic and cultural adaptations that had kept them alive when death seemed certain. These weren't just any humans. These were humans who had been forged by the worst environmental crisis in our species' history. They were the ancestors of every human who had come after. Every person alive today carries genes that survived 117,000 years of near extinction. Genes selected for intelligence, cooperation, and adaptability under the most extreme conditions imaginable. We are all descendants of the survivors, all products of the bottleneck, all evidence that sometimes when everything goes wrong, a few individuals can be tough enough to keep hope alive until the world becomes livable again. But the recovery didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen the same way everywhere. Picture this. You're standing in East Africa around 800,000 years ago. The worst is over, but the landscape is still harsh. Not everyone survived the bottleneck in the same condition. Some groups had maintained their population numbers better than others. Some had developed better survival technologies. Some had just gotten lucky, finding refuges with more reliable resources. These differences created a patchwork of recovery. In some regions, populations bounce back quickly. Archaeological sites from this period show sudden increases in the density of artifacts. More stone tools, more evidence of fire use, more signs of human activity. But these aren't random increases. They're clustered around specific locations, river valleys that had maintained flowing water throughout the crisis, coastal areas where marine resources had remained available, highland regions where elevation created microclimates that were more stable than the lowlands. The smart survivors had found the good spots and held on to them. But now, with the climate improving, they were ready to expand, and expand they did. The genetic evidence paints a picture of rapid population growth starting around 800,000 years ago. Not a steady gradual increase, but an explosion. Population size estimates jump from those 1,280 breeding individuals to tens of thousands within just 50,000 years. That's not just recovery, that's what biologists call a population boom, and population booms create genetic signatures that we can still read today. When a small population expands rapidly, certain genetic variants get carried along for the ride. They spread not necessarily because they're beneficial, but simply because they happen to be in the founder population when the expansion began. This is called the founder effect, and it's written all over modern human DNA. Think about it like this. Imagine you're one of those 1,280 survivors. You carry a particular genetic variant, maybe one that affects your eye color, or your lactose tolerance, or your resistance to certain diseases. Under normal circumstances, this variant might be rare, maybe showing up in 1 in 1,000 people. But you're not in normal circumstances. You're one of only 1,280 people left. When your descendants multiply and spread across the world, your genetic variant goes with them. Suddenly, something that should be rare becomes common in the entire human population. Not because it's particularly useful, but simply because you survived the bottleneck, and most other genetic lineages didn't. This is why modern humans have such weird genetic patterns compared to other great apes. Chimpanzees living in a single forest in Africa have more genetic diversity than the entire global human population. That's because they never went through a severe bottleneck. Their populations have been large and stable for millions of years, allowing genetic diversity to accumulate naturally. But humans? We're all descended from those 1,280 individuals. Every genetic variant in the modern human population had to pass through that narrow filter. The ones that made it through became common. The ones that didn't are gone forever. But here's where it gets really interesting. The recovery wasn't just about population numbers, it was about innovation. The archaeological record from 800,000 to 600,000 years ago shows an explosion of new technologies. Stone tools become more sophisticated, more specialized. Instead of simple choppers and scrapers, we start seeing carefully designed hand axes with symmetrical shapes and sharp edges, spear points that show evidence of being hefted onto wooden shafts. Composite tools made from multiple materials work together. This isn't just technological progress. This is evidence of changing minds. Making a symmetrical hand axe requires planning. You need to visualize the finished tool before you start working. You need to understand the properties of stone well enough to predict how it will fracture. You need fine motor control and patience. These are cognitive abilities that go beyond simple problem solving. They're evidence of abstract thinking of the ability to hold mental models of things that don't yet exist. The Bottleneck survivors had developed these abilities during the crisis, refined them through thousands of generations of intense selection. Now, with populations expanding and groups coming back into contact with each other, these innovations could spread rapidly through social learning. Imagine a young person watching an elder craft a perfect hand axe. They learn not just by trial and error, but by observation and instruction. They can ask questions, receive feedback, practice under supervision. This is cultural transmission, and it's far more powerful than genetic evolution alone. Within a few generations, a useful innovation could spread across hundreds of miles, passed from group to group through trade networks and kinship connections. But the most important innovations weren't technological, they were social. The groups that survived the bottleneck had developed something unprecedented in the animal kingdom. The ability to maintain cooperation across large networks of individuals, not just immediate family groups, but extended clans connected by kinship and reciprocal obligations. During the crisis, these networks had been lifelines. A group facing starvation could send emissaries to allied groups asking for help. When disaster struck one band, survivors could take refuge with distant relatives. This system had kept the human network alive when any single group would have failed. Now, during the recovery, these social networks became engines of expansion. Instead of simply breeding until local resources were exhausted, successful groups could send out colonizing parties. Young adults leaving their birth group to establish new communities in empty territories, but maintaining connections to their home group through visiting, trade, and intermarriage. This created what anthropologists call a fission-fusion dynamic. Groups splitting when they got too large for local resources, but maintaining social connections that allowed them to fuse back together when necessary. It's the same strategy that had kept humanity alive during the bottleneck, but now operating at a much larger scale. The genetic evidence shows exactly this pattern. When we analyze modern human DNA, we see signs of what geneticists call admixture events. Moments when previously separated populations came back into contact and exchanged genes. These admixture events cluster in time around the post-bottleneck recovery period. Groups that had been isolated during the worst of the crisis were meeting again, trading, intermarrying, sharing technologies and knowledge. This mixing accelerated human evolution in ways that wouldn't have been possible in a stable, isolated population. Think of it like shuffling a deck of cards. Each group had developed its own unique combinations of genetic variants, selected for survival in their particular refuge. When these groups mixed, their genetic variants recombined in new ways, creating combinations that had never existed before. Some of these new combinations were spectacular successes. Maybe someone inherited their mother's genes for efficient fat storage and their father's genes for endurance running. In the harsh environments of post-bottleneck Africa, this combination could be the difference between life and death. Natural selection had more raw material to work with than it had seen in hundreds of thousands of years. The result was rapid evolution of distinctly human traits, larger brains relative to body size, more efficient upright walking, better fine motor control for tool making, enhanced vocal abilities for complex communication. All of these traits show signs of positive selection in the genetic record from this period. But perhaps the most important evolutionary change was happening in the realm of cognition. The archaeological record from 700,000 years ago onward shows evidence of increasingly complex behavior. Controlled use of fire becomes common, with hearths showing up regularly at archaeological sites. This isn't just fire use, which other human species had practiced for hundreds of thousands of years. This is fire management, building fires in specific locations, maintaining them over days or weeks, using them for cooking, light, warmth, and protection from predators. Fire management requires planning, cooperation, and the ability to teach firemaking skills to the next generation. It's technology that depends on culture, not just individual learning. We also start seeing evidence of long-distance transport of raw materials. Stone tools found hundreds of miles from the quarries where their raw material originated. Shells from coastal areas showing up at inland sites. This tells us that groups were either travelling long distances or more likely participating in trade networks that moved goods through multiple exchanges. Trade requires abstract thinking. You need to understand the concept of delayed reciprocity. I give you something valuable now, trusting that you or your group will provide something valuable in return later. This is a profound cognitive leap, one that requires both memory and trust. The Bottleneck survivors had developed these abilities because groups that couldn't cooperate, couldn't maintain long-term reciprocal relationships, simply didn't survive the crisis. But now these same abilities were allowing rapid colonization of new territories. A group moving into unknown terrain could rely on connections with distant groups for information, resources, even rescue if things went wrong. This reduced the risk of expansion, making it possible for humans to spread into environments that would have been too dangerous for isolated bands. By 600,000 years ago, humans had recolonized most of Africa and were beginning to push into Europe and Asia, not as timid refugees, but as confident colonizers carrying sophisticated technologies and complex social systems. This was the legacy of the Bottleneck. Not just survival, but transformation. The crisis had acted like an evolutionary forge, burning away populations that lack the cognitive flexibility, social cooperation, and technological innovation necessary to survive. What emerged from the forge was fundamentally different from what had entered it. These post-Bottleneck humans weren't just another primate species. They were something new, something unprecedented in the history of life on Earth. They were the foundation upon which all future human evolution would build. Every advance in human cognition, every technological innovation, every form of social organization from tribes to civilizations, all of it traces back to the adaptations forged during those 117,000 years of crisis and the explosive recovery that followed. We're still living with the consequences of that bottleneck. Our genetic diversity, our cognitive abilities, our capacity for cooperation and innovation all bear its mark. The recovery wasn't just about population numbers bouncing back. It was about humanity becoming human. And the most remarkable part? This was still just the beginning. The real story of human evolution, the part that would lead to art, language, agriculture, cities, and everything else we associate with human civilization, was still hundreds of thousands of years in the future. But none of it would have been possible without the recovery. Without those Bottleneck survivors who refused to give up, who adapted and innovated and cooperated their way through the worst crisis in human history, then exploded back across the world when conditions improved, carrying with them the genetic and cultural toolkit that would eventually let their descendants dominate the planet. We are their legacy, every one of us, carrying genes refined by 117,000 years of crisis and validated by 800,000 years of success. When you think about it like that, human history looks less like a straight line from primitive to advanced, and more like a story of survival against impossible odds, followed by an explosion of innovation that's still ongoing today. But the recovery created new challenges. As human populations spread and diversified, they began evolving in different directions, adapting to different environments, developing different cultures and technologies. Within a few 100,000 years, the descendants of the Bottleneck survivors would split into multiple distinct species, each following its own evolutionary path. And that's when things get really interesting. So here we are. We've traced the story of humanity's closest brush with extinction, followed our ancestors through 117,000 years of desperate survival, watched them emerge transformed and ready to dominate the planet. But here's the thing that should make you sit up and pay attention. This isn't just ancient history. This near-extinction event is still affecting every single one of us, right now, today, in ways that scientists are only beginning to understand. Because when you reduce an entire species to 1,280 breeding individuals, you don't just create a historical footnote, you create lasting consequences that echo through every generation that follows. And some of those consequences aren't exactly comforting. Let's start with the most obvious one, genetic diversity, or rather, the lack of it. Right now, at this very moment, there are more genetic differences between two groups of chimpanzees living 100 miles apart in Africa than there are between humans living on opposite sides of the planet. Think about that. A random chimp in Tanzania is more genetically different from a chimp in Uganda than you are from someone living in Japan, Nigeria, or Brazil. Humans are one of the least genetically diverse species on Earth, and it's all because of that bottleneck. This lack of diversity isn't just an interesting fact for geneticists. It has real consequences. It means we're all susceptible to many of the same diseases. A pandemic that can infect one human can potentially infect any human, because we're all working with basically the same genetic instruction manual. Our immune systems, for all their sophistication, are variations on the same limited theme. When COVID-19 swept across the world, it wasn't encountering 6 billion genetically diverse individuals. It was encountering 6 billion variations of the same 1,280 survivors. We're all cousins fighting the same fight with similar weapons. But here's where it gets really interesting. That genetic bottleneck also seems to have done something to our brains, and scientists are racing to figure out exactly what. Remember those chromosomes that fused together during the bottleneck period, the ones that turned 24 chromosome pairs into 23? Recent research suggests that fusion event might have been near genes involved in brain development. Not random chance, not a neutral mutation, but something that actually affected how our brains grew and functioned. Researchers at the Institute for Systems Genomics have been studying the specific location of that chromosomal fusion. They've found that it occurred right next to a cluster of genes that regulate neural growth during fetal development. This might explain why all three post-bottleneck human species developed larger, more complex brains than their ancestors. The fusion event could have literally rewired how our brains develop. But they're also finding something else, something that makes the story more complicated. That same genetic region shows unusual patterns of variation in modern humans. Patterns that suggest ongoing evolution, continuing selection pressure even after the bottleneck ended. Our brains might still be evolving in response to challenges that began nearly 1 million years ago. Right now, laboratories around the world are using new technologies that would have seemed like science fiction just a decade ago to peel back the mystery of the bottleneck period. Ancient DNA analysis has gotten so sophisticated that researchers can extract genetic material from 400,000-year-old fossils. They're literally reading the genetic code of our ancient ancestors, comparing it to modern humans, and tracking how specific genes changed over time. The Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology has been leading this charge. They've developed techniques that can recover DNA from tiny bone fragments, from soil samples taken from ancient cave floors, even from the hardened plaque on Neanderthal teeth, and every new sample tells them something about the bottleneck and its aftermath. One of their most stunning recent discoveries: they found Neanderthal DNA in a cave in Siberia that dates to 120,000 years ago. But when they analysed it, they found something unexpected. This particular Neanderthal had a tiny amount of modern human DNA. Not from recent interbreeding. This was ancient, possibly dating back to the early stages of species divergence right after the bottleneck. It suggests the separation between modern humans and Neanderthals wasn't clean. There was mixing, separation, and mixing again over hundreds of thousands of years. The story is messier and more interesting than anyone imagined. Then there's the technology that's revolutionizing our understanding of ancient climates. Scientists can now drill ice cores in Antarctica that contain air bubbles from 800,000 years ago, literally trapped atmosphere from the bottleneck period. By analyzing these bubbles, they can reconstruct temperature, atmospheric composition, even the concentration of different pollens that tell them what plants were growing where. What they're finding is terrifying. The climate during the bottleneck period fluctuated more wildly than during any other time in the past 2 million years. Temperature swings of 10 to 15 degrees Celsius within just a few decades, rainfall patterns that would shift dramatically within a single generation. It wasn't just one long crisis, it was crisis after crisis, each one requiring our ancestors to adapt or die. And here's where the modern implications become impossible to ignore. Because we're entering a period of rapid climate change right now. Not natural this time, but human-caused. And the patterns we're seeing, the speed of change, the disruption to established weather systems, they're starting to look uncomfortably similar to what happened during the bottleneck. Climate scientists studying the bottleneck period have found something that should make all of us pay attention. During those 117,000 years, the climate didn't just get worse and stay worse, it destabilized. Predictable patterns broke down. Monsoons failed randomly. Areas that had been wet for generations would suddenly experience decades-long droughts. Then just as suddenly the rains would return, but in the wrong season or the wrong amounts. This is what instability looks like. Not just change, but unpredictability. And it's exactly what our current climate models suggest we're moving toward. The collapse of the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, the disruption of the Indian monsoon, the unpredictable behavior of El Niño patterns. We're not just warming the planet, we're destabilizing the systems that allowed human civilization to flourish. Our ancestors survived the last great instability, but just barely. And they had something we don't: empty continents. When one region became uninhabitable, they could move to another. When resources collapsed in one area, there were unoccupied territories to migrate to. We've filled up the planet. There's nowhere left to go. Understanding how they survived isn't just academic curiosity. It might be essential for our own survival. But the research isn't just about climate. Geneticists are also looking at what the bottleneck can tell us about population dynamics and extinction risk. Because here's an uncomfortable truth. We came terrifyingly close to going extinct, and it wasn't a meteor impact or a supervolcano that nearly finished us. It was environmental stress combined with small population size. The exact combination we're starting to see in endangered species today. Conservation biologists are studying the human bottleneck to understand how small populations survive. What's the minimum viable population for a large mammal species? How much genetic diversity do you need to maintain long-term evolutionary potential? How do you preserve adaptation capacity when your gene pool becomes limited? Every answer they find by studying our ancestors helps them design better conservation strategies for endangered species now. The numbers they're coming up with aren't comforting. Many researchers now think 1,280 breeding individuals was probably close to the absolute minimum for a species like ours. Much smaller and genetic problems start accumulating faster than natural selection can fix them. Harmful mutations begin spreading through the population. Genetic diversity drops so low that the species loses the ability to adapt to new challenges. Death spiral territory. We got lucky. our ancestors threaded an impossibly narrow needle, maintaining just enough genetic diversity to stay viable while facing environmental pressures that should have killed them. Understanding exactly how they did it isn't just fascinating, it's potentially life-saving knowledge for other species facing similar bottlenecks. Meanwhile, paleoanthropologists are racing to find more fossils from the bottleneck period. Because here's the frustrating reality. We still have huge gaps in our knowledge. We have plenty of fossils from before the bottleneck, lots from after, but the period between 930,000 and 813,000 years ago, that's a desert. A handful of fragmentary remains, most too incomplete to tell us much. The search is focused on East Africa, particularly the Rift Valley, where geological conditions are most likely to have preserved fossils from this period. Teams are using satellite imaging to identify ancient lake beds and river systems that might have served as refugia during the crisis. They're looking for places where our ancestors could have survived, where fossils might still be waiting, and they're finding tantalizing hints. A jawbone fragment from Kenya dated to 900,000 years ago. Some stone tools from Tanzania that might date to the middle of the bottleneck period. Nothing definitive yet, but every discovery adds another piece to the puzzle. The real breakthrough might come from an unexpected direction. Caves. Recent discoveries have shown that our ancestors used caves more extensively during the bottleneck period than previously thought. Caves provided shelter from extreme weather, protection from predators, and stable microclimates when conditions outside became intolerable. And caves are excellent for fossil preservation. Right now, researchers are systematically exploring cave systems across Africa, using ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive technologies to identify promising sites before they start digging. It's slow work, but it's how major discoveries happen. One lucky find, one well-preserved skeleton from the heart of the bottleneck period, could revolutionize our understanding of what happened. But even without that smoking gun fossil, new analytical techniques are revealing information from fossils that have been sitting in museums for decades. Improved dating methods, microscopic analysis of toothwear patterns, isotopic studies that reveal diet and migration patterns. Fossils that were excavated 50 years ago are yielding new secrets with 21st century technology. There's also fierce debate in the scientific community about some fundamental questions. Not everyone agrees on the severity of the bottleneck. Some researchers think it might have been even worse than current estimates suggest, with breeding populations dropping below 1,000 individuals for brief periods. Others argue it wasn't quite as extreme, that there might have been slightly larger populations in isolated refugia that we haven't detected yet genetically. There's also controversy about what caused the recovery. Did the climate simply improve, or did our ancestors develop new technologies and strategies that allowed them to expand even while conditions were still challenging? The timing's ambiguous enough that both explanations could be partially correct. And here's a question that keeps researchers up at night. Could it happen again? Not the exact same scenario, obviously, but another bottleneck. Another period where human population crashes to a tiny fraction of current numbers. The honest answer is yes. Absolutely yes. Whether from climate change, pandemic disease, nuclear war, or something we haven't even thought of yet, there's no law of nature that says humanity gets to survive indefinitely. But here's what studying the bottleneck teaches us. Resilience is possible. Our ancestors faced conditions that should have killed them, that did kill most of their relatives and competitors. But they survived through a combination of intelligence, cooperation, technological innovation, and sheer, stubborn refusal to give up. Those traits didn't disappear when the crisis ended. We still carry them. The question is whether we're smart enough to use them. Because that's ultimately what this research is about. Not just understanding the past, but using that understanding to navigate the future. Every discovery about how our ancestors survived their bottleneck is a lesson in resilience, adaptation, and the incredible tenacity of life under pressure. We're all bottleneck survivors, all descendants of people who refused to quit when quitting would have been so much easier. That legacy is written in every cell of your body, every firing synapse in your brain. The question facing us now is whether we're worthy of that legacy, whether we have the wisdom to see the challenges ahead and the courage to face them like our ancestors did. The research continues, the mysteries remain, but every answer brings us closer to understanding not just where we came from, but what we're capable of when survival itself hangs in the balance. So here we are, after everything we've explored, after diving deep into the genetic evidence, the climate data, the volcanic ash layers, and the archaeological gaps, we're left with a stunning realization. For nearly 117,000 years, our ancestors lived through something so catastrophic, so devastating, that it nearly erased humanity from existence. And yet here you are, listening to this. Here I am, telling you about it. We exist because somehow, impossibly, they survived. Think about what that means for a moment. Every person alive today, all 8 billion of us, we're all descendants of roughly 1,280 breeding individuals who made it through the worst environmental disaster in human history. Your ancestors survived when death seemed absolutely certain. They endured droughts that lasted generations, watched their children struggle with starvation, fought diseases we can't even name anymore. They lived in a world that was actively trying to kill them, and somehow they refused to die. That genetic bottleneck is still visible in your DNA right now. Every cell in your body carries the chromosomal fusion that marks you as a survivor's descendant. You have genes that were selected for intelligence, cooperation, and adaptability under the most extreme conditions imaginable. The reason humans are so good at problem solving, at working together, at adapting to new challenges, it's because the ones who couldn't do those things didn't make it through the gap. We were forged by catastrophe, refined by near extinction, made into something tougher, smarter, more resilient than we ever would have been otherwise. Some scientists argue that the bottleneck wasn't just a crisis, it was the crisis that made us human. That without those 117,000 years of desperate survival, we never would have developed the cognitive abilities, the social cooperation, the technological innovation that defines our species today. But here's the thing that keeps researchers up at night. We still don't know exactly what happened. We've got theories, sure. Climate collapse, supervolcanic eruptions, disease outbreaks, competition with other species. Probably all of the above working together in some horrific perfect storm. But the details remain frustratingly out of reach, buried in that million-year gap where the evidence just goes quiet. Where exactly did those 1,280 survivors live? How did they organize themselves? What technologies did they develop that we've never found? What stories did they tell their children about the world before the disaster? What knowledge did they lose forever when their population crashed? These questions haunt the scientific community because the answers are out there somewhere, locked in rocks we haven't examined, in fossil sites we haven't discovered, in genetic patterns we haven't fully decoded yet, and that's what makes this so exciting. This isn't ancient history that's been fully figured out and filed away. This is an active mystery. Right now, as you're listening to this, researchers are analysing new fossil finds, running computer models of ancient climate, extracting DNA from archaeological sites, trying to piece together what really happened during those lost millennia. Every year brings new discoveries, new insights, new pieces of the puzzle. Maybe in your lifetime, we'll finally solve it. Maybe some graduate student working late in a genetics lab will find the smoking gun that explains everything. maybe an archaeological team will discover a site perfectly preserved from the middle of the Bottleneck, showing us exactly how those survivors lived. Or maybe the mystery will persist, reminding us that even with all our modern technology, there are still profound questions about our own origins that remain unanswered. But whether we solve it completely or not, the lesson remains clear. Humans are survivors. We've been to the edge of extinction and fought our way back. We've endured environmental catastrophes that would have destroyed most species. We've taken the worst the planet could throw at us and not just survived, but thrived, eventually spreading to every continent and becoming the most successful large animal in Earth's history. That's your heritage. That's written in your bones, coded in your genes, inherited from ancestors who refused to give up when everything seemed hopeless. The next time you face a challenge that seems insurmountable, remember you come from people who survived 117,000 years of hell and came out stronger. So now I want to hear from you. What do you think happened during that million-year gap? Which theory makes the most sense to you? And more importantly, where are you listening from right now? Are you falling asleep in New York, drifting off in London, getting drowsy in Tokyo? Drop a comment and let me know. Hit that like button if this deep dive into human prehistory blew your mind. Subscribe if you want more mysteries explored while you drift off to sleep. Because this is just one story. There are thousands more waiting to be told, and somewhere out there, another mystery is waiting to be solved. Sleep well, survivors.